On April 22, 1942, at 9:17 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare entered the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation facility in Bethpage, New York, bearing crucial information that would alter America's approach to the Pacific War. At 27 years old, O'Hare had 7 confirmed aerial victories and wore the Medal of Honor, which he received from President Franklin D. Roosevelt the previous day. His visit was not for a public relations event, but rather to address the urgent need for better aircraft design due to American pilots' fatalities in inferior planes compared to Japanese Zero fighters. Awaiting him inside was William Schwendler, Grumman's chief engineer, aged 38 and 15 years of experience designing naval aircraft. Schwendler had been tasked since June 30th, 1941, 6 months before the Pearl Harbor attack, to develop a successor to the F4F Wildcat. The prototype was set to take flight in 2 months' time. However, the design was far from complete. Schwendler understood that perfection was essential because the current fighter, the Wildcat, was failing its pilots. The Wildcat's performance lagged behind the Zero and reached a top speed of 318 mph compared to Zero's 350 mph. The Wildcat also struggled in climbing and turning maneuvers against the Zero, which could complete a full circle twice as fast as the Wildcat could manage. This critical disparity often resulted in fatal outcomes for American pilots. Consequently, official doctrine advised Wildcat pilots never to engage in dogfighting with Zeros. Instead, they were instructed to rely on speed and altitude advantages. Submerge, fire, exit, evade. Avoid prolonged engagements that might entangle you. However, the Wildcat couldn't consistently adhere to this strategy due to its limitations. Zeros could outmaneuver Wildcats during climbs and catch up after dives because of a minimal performance difference. This left American pilots in unfavorable turning dogfights they were destined to lose, often resulting in their deaths. Within the first 4 months of the war, 42 Wildcats had been lost, most shot down when better aircraft capabilities could have made a critical difference. The training literature blamed these losses on pilot mistakes, while tactical experts pointed fingers at non-compliance with strategic guidelines. Yet, O'Hare understood differently. It wasn't about the pilots' skill but rather the inferiority of their planes. Although the Wildcat was suitable for 1941 standards, by 1942 the Japanese Zero had established a 2-year head start in combat experience and tactical refinement. They were well aware of how to take advantage of the Wildcat's weaknesses, resulting in a heavy toll on American pilots. O'Hare had already alerted the Bureau of Aeronautics about this concern 2 weeks prior. The Bureau took him seriously due to his credibility. On February 20, 1942, Howe demonstrated exceptional skill by defending the carrier Lexington against 9 Japanese bombers alone. He managed to shoot down 5 of them in less than 5 minutes using just 60 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, showcasing the most impressive aerial gunnery performance ever witnessed by the Navy. This feat earned him the Medal of Honor, but more significantly, he had completed 14 combat missions flying the Wildcat and lived to tell about it. His intimate knowledge of the aircraft allowed him to identify its strengths and weaknesses clearly. He understood what American pilots required for survival in combat. Consequently, the Bureau of Aeronautics dispatched O'Hare to Grumman with a straightforward directive: share every detail he knew, explain how the Zero operated, pinpoint the Wildcat's deficiencies, and convey the essential features needed for the next generation of fighter planes. He was instructed not to withhold any information or soften his critique, because lives were at stake in ensuring this accuracy. During his 4-hour meeting with Schwendler and Grumman's design team, O'Hare provided a thorough analysis of Zero tactics, detailing how they lured American pilots into turning maneuvers and maintained altitude superiority thanks to their superior climb rate. They leveraged their superior range to engage combat far inside American airspace. He detailed the shortcomings of the Wildcat, its sluggish controls, insufficient power, narrow landing gear that posed risks during carrier operations, and the hand-cranked landing gear which exposed pilots to danger upon approach. The cockpit's poor visibility also hindered threat detection. However, O'Hare highlighted the aircraft's strengths as well. The Wildcat was robust, capable of withstanding damage that would likely destroy a Zero. It boasted 6 .50 caliber machine guns equipped with substantial ammunition reserves and provided armor protection for pilots along with self-sealing fuel tanks. This allowed American pilots to make errors without fatal consequences, unlike their Japanese counterparts. A single burst from the Wildcat's guns often resulted in a downed Zero. The challenge lay in positioning oneself to deliver that critical burst of fire. Improved performance, higher speed, greater power, enhanced climb rate, better visibility, and more manageable controls were essential for success. Schwendler meticulously jotted down copious notes while posing specific inquiries about visibility angles, control responsiveness, engine power output, landing features, and combat scenarios. He sought precise details, numerical data, measurements, and exact descriptions of each encounter. O'Hare furnished all the information he could recall. The actions taken over the following 4 months would determine America's capability to triumph in the Pacific Air War. Lieutenant James Gray, a member of the Lexington Air Group, was the first pilot O'Hare knew who perished while battling Zeros in a Wildcat on February 21, 1942. With extensive experience and a rigorous approach, he had completed 30 missions without taking any unnecessary risks. On February 21st, during an aerial engagement near a ball, Gray's division encountered 4 Zero fighters at an altitude of 8,000 feet. Adhering strictly to military doctrine, Gray initiated the attack by diving from above and accelerating toward his target, firing a deflection shot at one of the trailing Zeros before attempting to climb out of harm's way. However, the lack of power in his Wildcat aircraft prevented him from climbing quickly enough. An opposing Zero then reversed course and dove on Gray's position from high altitude, shooting him down before he could reach a safe height. Gray's wingman witnessed the entire incident and affirmed that Gray had executed all maneuvers flawlessly according to protocol. The strategy was sound, but the slow climb rate of his aircraft proved insufficient in evading the enemy. Despite following every guideline set forth by the Navy, Gray succumbed to his injuries 3 miles from the Lexington after being shot down while attempting to disengage from a previously engaged adversary. The official report concluded that pilot error was responsible for the incident, citing specific actions such as failing to maintain adequate speed during the climb and underestimating the maneuverability of the Zero. Yet Gray's wingman contended that the issue lay not with the pilot but rather with the inherent limitations of the Wildcat aircraft itself. By April 1942, O'Hare had witnessed 17 pilots lose their lives. Some were close acquaintances, while others he only briefly encountered during pre-flight briefings or operational duties on the flight deck. He shared missions with every one of them, watched them taxi and take off, and heard their voices crackling over the radio. Those who returned recounted similar experiences. The F4F Wildcat was too slow to climb, lacked agility in rolls, and was underpowered for the combat conditions they faced. Most pilots assumed these limitations were simply a consequence of having large radial engines and substantial weight. However, O'Hare had a different perspective. He had flown against Zero fighters and knew firsthand that such performance shortcomings couldn't be tolerated. His survival depended not only on being more skilled than average, but also on sheer luck. Yet, the majority of pilots wouldn't have those same advantages in Wildcats. Eventually, even good fortune would run out. The Navy required a fighter aircraft capable of providing an edge to ordinary pilots through superior overall performance. That evening, after Gray's death, O'Hare confided his thoughts to Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, his squadron commander. Thatch concurred, mentioning that he had developed a defensive tactic called the Thatch Weave, which helped Wildcats survive against Zeros, but it was merely an interim measure rather than a long-term fix. The true solution lay in obtaining better aircraft. When asked what could be done from their position within the squadron, O'Hare admitted there was little they could do directly. These modifications necessitated input directly from the manufacturer, as only they could implement such engineering alterations. It was imperative to have someone with first-hand combat experience against Zeros convey this issue straight to the designers of future fighter planes. According to Thatch, the Bureau of Aeronautics had already initiated steps to address this matter and intended for O'Hare to visit Grumman following his Medal of Honor ceremony. It wasn't a suggestion but an imperative directive. The challenge didn't lie in American pilots being unaware of their tactics. They were well versed in them, with every briefing underscoring the importance of these strategies and each training session reinforcing them. Never engage in turns against Zeros, rely on speed and altitude, conduct hit-and-run attacks. The doctrine was crystal clear. However, actual combat often deviated from established doctrines. William Schwendler had been involved in naval aircraft design since 1927. At the age of 41, he held a degree from Cornell University and was widely regarded as one of America's premier aircraft engineers. Having started his career with Glenn Curtiss before joining Grumman in 1930, Schwendler had designed significant planes like the F-30F biplane fighter and the F4F Wildcat, and was currently leading the development team for the F6F Hellcat. Schwendler understood that the Wildcat faced certain issues. Pilots frequently complained about its narrow landing gear, manual crank mechanism, and poor cockpit visibility, but these were recognized problems. Schwendler required first-hand combat data against actual Zero fighters. While the Bureau of Aeronautics supplied some reports, most were second-hand accounts penned by officers who had never engaged in aerial battles. O'Hare's visit stood out because he was a seasoned fighter pilot with numerous encounters against Zeros and survived to recount them. He could vividly describe the dynamics of dogfights, sharing insights on what tactics worked or failed and what improvements pilots required. On April 2, 1942, during a 4-hour meeting, O'Hare provided Schwendler with detailed information. Schwendler took extensive notes over 18 pages as he inquired about various aspects of Zero performance, including maneuverability, climb rate, speed at different altitudes, armament and pilot strategies. O'Hare elaborated on how Zeros would attack from above, utilizing their superior climbing ability, lure Wildcats into turns, exploit their extended operational range hundreds of miles away from bases, and take advantage of any altitude disadvantages. When asked what the Wildcat needed to compete effectively, O'Hare emphasized the importance of power, sufficient climb rate to outpace a Zero at altitudes over 10,000 feet, and enough speed to outmaneuver it in level flight at all heights. The Wildcat's engine, which produced 200 horsepower from an R-1820 Cyclone unit, fell short of these requirements. The newly designed fighter required at least 2,000 horsepower, with an even higher output being ideal. Schwendler noted that the Pratini R-28 had 100 double Wasp engine generated exactly this amount of power and was already in use within the VAF-4U Corsair. O'Hare confirmed that Grumman could indeed incorporate it into the F6F model, emphasizing the critical importance of maximizing performance for the Pacific Air War. He stated unequivocally, absolutely, whatever steps are necessary to achieve greater power output are essential. The primary objective was to ensure that the fighter aircraft matched or surpassed their adversaries in Zero performance capabilities. Schwendler then inquired about additional enhancements. O'Hare proceeded to outline several key areas for improvement. Firstly, enhanced cockpit visibility was paramount. Pilots operating the Wildcats faced limited vision due to the cockpit's low placement within the fuselage, rendering certain threats undetectable. For this reason, a higher mounted cockpit offering superior all-around sightlines was crucial in the new design. Furthermore, O'Hare stressed the need for hydraulic landing gear to replace the hazardous hand crank mechanism used by the Wildcats, which left pilots with only one hand available during carrier approaches, significantly increasing risk levels. The new fighter should feature fully automated landing capable of extending and retracting simply via a switch operation. Lastly, better armor protection was essential. While the Wildcats did offer some level of protection, it fell short in critical areas such as around the cockpit, oil tank, and fuel tanks. The upcoming model must include more robust shielding to safeguard these vital components effectively, aiming for more robust armament if feasible. While 60-50 caliber machine guns were effective, additional firepower was preferable. Perhaps 8 of them or even 20 mm cannons, whichever could fit within the design constraints. Schwendler assured that these modifications were plausible given the F6F's adaptable blueprint. Major alterations could be implemented prior to the initial prototype's flight, yet official clearance from the Bureau of Aeronautics was mandatory. Grumman couldn't unilaterally modify the aircraft based on a single pilot's recommendations, even if that pilot held the Medal of Honor. O'Hare pledged to discuss this matter with the Bureau. The Navy sought a fighter capable of outperforming the Zero. Should Grumman produce such an aircraft, approval would follow swiftly. Financial constraints were not the limiting factor, rather, time was of essence. On April 26, 1942, 4 days later, the Bureau issued a directive to Grumman: outfit the second F6F prototype with the Pratt & Whitney R2D800 double Wasp engine and redesign the airframe accordingly to accommodate its extra power. Elevate the cockpit for better visibility and integrate hydraulic landing gear. Incorporate as much armor protection as structural integrity would allow, retaining 60-50 caliber machine guns due to weight limitations but designing wings that could be upgraded later if needed. The Navy required this fighter in combat by mid-1943 at latest. Schwendler's team dedicated themselves to the task around the clock. The F6F prototype underwent an extensive redesign over 8 weeks, necessitating several significant changes. A new engine demanded a larger engine mount and a bigger propeller, while reinforced wing spars were required to manage increased torque. The hydraulic landing gear required entirely new mechanisms and additional hydraulic systems. With the cockpit raised higher, there was a need for structural modifications to the forward fuselage. Additional armor also added 2 to 12 pounds to the empty weight of the aircraft. Despite these changes, the plane became larger and heavier but also faster and more powerful. On July 30, 1942, test pilot Robert Hall took the F6F on its inaugural flight. At that time, Grumman's factory in Bethpage was still being constructed. Workers were busy installing equipment in the new building No. 3, while initial Hellcat assemblies were taking place inside the existing facilities. The production timeline was extremely tight, with the Navy demanding operational aircraft by early 1943, which meant that manufacturing had to begin before testing was completed. Hall flew the F6F for 45 minutes during his test flight, evaluating its climb rate, maximum speed, control responsiveness, stall characteristics, and landing approach. Upon landing, he reported to Schwendler that the aircraft was exceptional, comparing it favorably to a Wildcat with double the power. The controls were responsive, visibility was excellent, and the landing performance was satisfactory. This aircraft represented exactly what the Navy needed for its operations. However, Hall also highlighted several issues. The engine tended to overheat under high power settings, and the landing gear deployment was excessively slow. Additionally, there were synchronization problems with the guns. These were typical prototype challenges that required resolution prior to production commencement. Schwendler's team returned to their workstations and made modifications to enhance cooling by altering the engine cowling design. They also adjusted hydraulic pressure for quicker gear extension and improved gun synchronization mechanisms. Within 3 weeks, they had addressed all of Hall's concerns. On October 3, 1942, the initial production F6F model took its maiden flight and was approved by the Navy. Production accelerated rapidly in January 1943. By the end of December 1942, 12 aircraft had been manufactured, while the first quarter of 1943 saw a substantial increase to 128 units, with April alone witnessing the assembly of 130 Hellcats. By summer 1943, was fabricating 500 Hellcats each month. The factory operated non-stop around the clock to meet demand. Workers were producing aircraft at a pace faster than pilots could be trained to fly them, and every single F6F incorporated O'Hare's recommendations from April 1942. Neither O'Hare nor Schwendler foresaw that these improvements would drastically alter the course of aerial warfare in the Pacific within 6 months. The first squadron to receive the Hellcats was Fighting Squadron 9, stationed at Naval Air Station Norfolk, Virginia. They received their initial 6F models in January 1943. Lieutenant Commander Philip Torrey led the squadron. He was 31 years old and had been serving in naval aviation for 9 years. Torrey had extensive combat experience with Wildcats, well aware of how inferior they were compared to Zeros. Upon first encountering the Hellcat, he was astonished that it came from the same manufacturer as the Wildcat. Not only was the Hellcat larger in dimensions, 33 feet 7 inches long versus 28 feet 10 inches for the Wildcat, and boasting a wider wingspan of 42 feet 10 inches compared to the Wildcat's 38 feet, but it also had a significantly greater empty weight at 238 pounds as opposed to the Wildcat's 758 pounds. Moreover, the Hellcat outperformed its predecessor in speed, reaching a top velocity of 380 miles per hour at an altitude of 17,300 feet. While the Wildcat could only manage 318 miles per hour, the climb rate was also superior, with the Hellcat ascending at 3,500 feet per minute versus the Wildcat's 300 feet per minute. Additionally, the Hellcat boasted a greater range of low 40 miles when equipped with an auxiliary fuel tank compared to the Wildcat's 950 miles. Its Art-2.8 engine delivered an impressive 2,000 horsepower, further cementing its dominance. The improvements were stark. Torrey informed his pilots that this aircraft would revolutionize their capabilities in battle. No longer would they need to avoid Zeros, now they could engage them head-on. Squadron 9 underwent rigorous training over 5 months, focusing on gunnery skills, formation flying techniques, carrier landings, and combat tactics. The Hellcat's design was an enhancement over the Wildcat in many aspects. For instance, its hydraulic landing gear simplified the landing process dramatically. Instead of manually cranking a handle numerous times while maintaining tight formations, pilots merely activated a switch to extend the landing gear automatically. Enhanced visibility also made formation flying more secure and reliable. The additional power made all maneuvers smoother, but it also increased the aircraft's weight and speed. Consequently, pilots needed to adapt their landing techniques and become familiar with new weight and balance restrictions. By August 1943, VF-9 was combat ready and deployed aboard the USS Essex as part of Task Force 15. This task force also included the carriers Yorktown and Independence, marking the first carrier group entirely equipped with Hellcats. There were no Wildcats in sight. Every fighter plane in the task force was an F6F. This marked the debut of America's new naval fighter in combat, and the Navy intended to make it a noteworthy event. The mission targeted Marcus Island, a Japanese outpost located 850 miles northwest of Wake Island. The island housed airfields, radar stations, and supply centers defended by around 35 aircraft, mostly Zeros, and heavy anti-aircraft artillery. Task Force 15 was scheduled to strike at dawn on August 31, 1943, aiming to cause maximum damage before the Japanese could organize a cohesive defense. At 4:15 a.m. on that day, planes began taking off from the carriers. Torrey led VF-9 from the Essex, while Commander Charles Crummell led VF-5 from the Yorktown. The Hellcats assembled in the pre-dawn darkness and set course for Marcus Island. They arrived at 5:50 a.m. as the sun ascended over the Pacific, revealing the island below them clearly visible through the morning light. Torrey observed several aircraft parked on the airfield, along with various structures dotted around the island, and noticed a prominent radar tower at its highest elevation. Torrey's squadron initiated the assault from the east, where the sun was positioned behind them, ensuring optimal visibility for their approach. The Japanese were utterly unprepared for the attack. Not a single fighter took to the air to intercept the incoming planes. The anti-aircraft defenses began firing immediately upon detection, but the Hellcats' superior speed allowed them to evade most of the gunfire. Torrey's squadron obliterated 6 grounded aircraft on their initial pass before climbing back up to altitude and preparing for another run. By this time, all units within the strike force had commenced their operations. Bombers targeted fuel storage facilities and supply buildings, while fighters engaged any moving targets they encountered. The island soon became enveloped in smoke and flames as a result of the intense bombardment. 2 Hellcats were lost to enemy anti-aircraft fire during the raid. 1 pilot perished on impact, and another was later rescued by a submarine 3 days after the assault. Despite these losses, not a single Japanese aircraft managed to take off from the island. The operation concluded as an overwhelming triumph. Most significantly, the performance of the Hellcat in actual combat validated its design specifications. It demonstrated exceptional speed, power, and resilience on the battlefield, earning enthusiastic praise from pilots who returned to their carriers aboard escort vessels. It was the complete opposite of what the Wildcat represented. This was precisely the fighter that America required. On September 1st, a Hellcat from the Independence intercepted a Japanese flying boat near Howland and Baker Islands. Lieutenant Junior Grade Richard Lowe and Ensign Arthur Nyquist successfully shot it down, marking the first aerial victory for the Hellcat. Further combat engagements soon followed. On October 5th, Hellcats dispatched from 4 carriers launched an attack on Wake Island, where they encountered a force of 34 Zero fighters. The Hellcats emerged victorious, shooting down 22 enemy planes while losing only 6 aircraft. 4 fell to Zeros and 2 succumbed to anti-aircraft fire. This resulted in a kill ratio significantly better than the Wildcat's historical performance. However, the most critical test for the Hellcat occurred on December 4, 1943, over Kwedlin Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Ninety 1 Hellcats from 3 carriers engaged with 50 Zero fighters defending the area. The Zeros aggressively employed the deflection shooting tactics that had previously inflicted heavy losses on Wildcat pilots for 2 years. Yet this time, those strategies failed to yield similar results. The Hellcats exhibited superior speed and climbing ability, boasting greater power. They could easily disengage from turning fights with Zeros and climb away unscathed. When Zeros attempted to dive, the Hellcats followed suit without difficulty. The performance gap had definitively shifted in favor of the Hellcat. The Americans now possessed superior aircraft. The engagement lasted for 37 minutes in total. During this time, the Hellcats managed to shoot down 28 Zero fighters while only losing 2 of their own planes. This resulted in a staggering kill ratio of 14-1. Marking it as the most one-sided aerial victory ever achieved by American naval aviation against Japanese fighter aircraft throughout World War II. It was evident that the Hellcat outperformed the Zero in combat. The news quickly spread across the Pacific Fleet, confirming the Hellcat's reputation as a formidable fighter. It wasn't merely an improvement over the Wildcat, it surpassed even the legendary Zero. American pilots finally had access to aircraft that provided them with a genuine advantage in aerial battles. By December's end, 6 carrier air groups were already outfitted with Hellcats, and more squadrons were in the process of transitioning to this new fighter model. The Navy's entire fighter force was moving towards adopting the F6F. Meanwhile, the Wildcat was being reassigned primarily to escort carriers due to its shorter takeoff distance, which remained advantageous for these smaller vessels. The Hellcat soon became the standard fleet carrier fighter, beloved by pilots for its capabilities. Japanese forces began to notice this shift in late 1943. Reports from both carrier and land-based air units indicated a change in American aerial performance. The new fighters were faster, more aggressive, and harder to evade compared to their predecessors like the Wildcat. Tactics that had previously been effective against Wildcats proved ineffective against these superior aircraft. The Japanese referred to the Hellcat as Grumman 6, setting it apart from its predecessor, the earlier Grumman 4 Wildcat. Despite this distinction, identifying the aircraft proved less challenging than countering its capabilities. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's leading aces with 64 confirmed kills and had been engaged in combat against American pilots since the attack on Pearl Harbor. Familiar with the weaknesses of the Wildcat, Sakai encountered a Hellcat for the first time in February 1944 over a battlefield, only to realize that his established tactics were no longer effective. Sakai attempted his usual strategy, positioning his Zero at an advantageous altitude, waiting for the American pilot to commit to an attack run, and then reversing course to dive behind the enemy aircraft during its climb out. This tactic had succeeded numerous times against Wildcats, but the Hellcat's superior climbing speed surprised Sakai. By the time he completed his dive and pulled up, the Hellcat was already back at altitude and preparing for a counterattack. For the first time in the war, Sakai was compelled to break off and disengage from a defensive position against an American fighter. Other experienced Japanese pilots reported similar encounters. The Americans were not employing new tactics. They still used the same boom and zoom maneuvers, but executed them more effectively due to their aircraft's enhanced performance capabilities. This fractional improvement was significant enough to disrupt the timing that Japanese pilots had honed over time. Japanese intelligence conducted an analysis of wreckage from downed Hellcats, searching for any modifications or new equipment, yet found nothing unusual. The Hellcat simply outperformed its predecessor in terms of power, speed, and climb rate. The engine was larger and the airframe was more robust, with everything crafted to surpass the Zero in critical combat scenarios. Despite this, the Japanese attempted various strategies. Some pilots adopted a cautious approach, only engaging when they had numerical superiority, while others became more aggressive, seeking dogfights where the Zero excelled at low speeds. However, both tactics were flawed. The former led to relinquishing control of battles, whereas the latter increased risk against an aircraft capable of enduring greater damage than the Zero. Consequently, Japanese pilots found themselves in a disadvantaged position. By mid-1944, carrier aviation for Japan was facing severe challenges. Most seasoned pilots had been lost during the Battle of Midway and the Solomon Islands campaign, leaving behind inadequately trained replacements. These newer pilots were flying aircraft designed for earlier combat conditions, namely the Zero, while they faced American pilots operating Hellcats that were specifically engineered to counter Zero tactics based on real-time combat feedback from Medal of Honor recipients. The outcome was inevitable. On June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea marked a turning point for the Hellcat. 14 American carriers with 480 Hellcats confronted 9 Japanese carriers equipped with roughly 370 aircraft, primarily Zeros. Throughout the day, the Japanese launched 4 massive assaults against the American fleet. In each instance, the Hellcats intercepted and engaged them effectively. The first raid alone resulted in a loss of 42 out of 69 aircraft. During the second raid, 98 out of 128 aircraft were lost. By day's end, Japanese forces had suffered a loss of 240 carrier planes and an additional 30 due to operational mishaps. The Americans, on the other hand, reported only 29 aircraft downed, primarily from anti-aircraft fire. Pilots flying Hellcats referred to it as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, marking it as one of the most lopsided aerial battles in naval history. One pilot likened the experience to hunting back home, but with Japanese planes that did not evade quickly enough. The kill ratio for this day was approximately 13-1, underscoring the dominance of the Hellcat over the Zero. The loss dealt a severe blow to Japanese carrier aviation and highlighted their disadvantage in both inexperienced pilots and inferior aircraft against seasoned American aviators flying Hellcats. Among those who distinguished themselves that day was Commander David McCampbell, Air Group Commander on the USS Essex. On June 19th, he shot down 7 Japanese planes, earning his status as an ace in a single day. 4 months later, on October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, McCampbell achieved this feat once more. Alongside his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, they engaged over 60 Japanese aircraft. McCampbell downed 9 planes, 7 Zeros and 2 Oscars, while Rushing brought down 6 others. Together, they destroyed a total of 15 aircraft in one mission, an accomplishment that stands as the most successful engagement by 2 pilots in American aviation history. Upon returning to the USS Langley, McCampbell landed with only 2 rounds of ammunition left and empty fuel tanks. The carrier's deck crew had given him up for lost after he'd been airborne for so long. By war's end, McCampbell had amassed 34 aerial victories, all in a Hellcat. He emerged as the Navy's top-ranking fighter ace of all time. For his heroic actions at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. His air group, KG-15, obliterated over 600 Japanese aircraft during their combat deployment, surpassing any other air group in the Pacific. Each pilot within KG-15 flew Hellcats that adhered to design specifications resulting from Butch O'Hare's discussions with Grumman engineers in April 1942. By November 1945, when Hellcat production ceased, Grumman had manufactured a total of 12 Tu-75 aircraft. At the peak of production in 1944, Grumman produced an astounding 64 Hellcats within a single month, equating to roughly one aircraft every hour round the clock. This was one of aviation's most successful manufacturing endeavors. The Hellcat achieved a remarkable kill ratio of 19:1 against Japanese planes. Approximately 3/4 of all Navy and Marine Corps aerial victories in the Pacific were scored by Hellcat pilots. A total of 306 pilots became aces while flying Hellcats, more than any other American fighter aircraft. Only about 2 to 70 Hellcats were lost in air to air combat throughout the war. The aircraft's success was so significant that late in the conflict, Navy evaluations placed it at the top of comparisons with Allied and captured Axis fighters across most categories. It outperformed the Zero in terms of speed, durability, armament, and ease of piloting. The only advantage the Zero retained was its low speed maneuverability, which became irrelevant when Hellcat pilots refused to engage in slow speed turning dogfights. This design evolved beyond what O'Hare could have envisioned. On November 26, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare took off on a night combat air patrol mission from the USS Enterprise in a Hellcat. He was experimenting with new tactics using radar-equipped Avenger torpedo bombers to guide fighters toward Japanese bombers attacking the fleet. The tactics were successful, and the formation intercepted enemy aircraft in the darkness. However, during the engagement, O'Hare's Hellcat vanished without trace, with radio messages going unanswered thereafter. The search planes did not locate anything. O'Hare was declared missing in action and presumed deceased at age 30. The official inquiry determined that he likely fell victim to either enemy anti-aircraft fire from a Japanese bomber or possibly friendly fire from the tail gunner of an Avengers aircraft. His remains were never recovered, nor was his plane ever discovered. He received a posthumous promotion to commander. In 1949, Orchard Field Airport in Chicago was renamed O'Hare International Airport in his memory. A restored Wildcat fighter jet bearing his insignia is on display at Terminal 2, featuring Japanese flags representing his aerial victories. The exhibit was inaugurated on the 75th anniversary of his Medal of Honor flight. William Schwendler continued to design aircraft for Grumman until the war's end, leading the development of the F7F Tigercat twin-engine fighter and contributing significantly to the F4F Bearcat's design. Post-war, he worked on jet aircraft before retiring in 1960. Despite his pivotal role in creating the Hellcat, Schwendler never received public acknowledgement for this achievement. However, internal Grumman documents referred to him as Chief Design Engineer. He passed away in the early 1980s, and his obituary noted his contributions to naval aircraft without mentioning his work on the Hellcat or his meeting with O'Hare that influenced its development. David McCampbell survived World War II and remained in the Navy, ultimately attaining the rank of captain. He served as commander of Bonhomme Richard during the late 1950s and held several staff positions throughout his career. McCampbell retired from active service in 1964. He continued his involvement in naval aviation circles by attending reunions and delivering speeches. One of his favorite stories was about the Hellcat, which he often described as the finest carrier-based fighter of World War II. He passed away in 1996 at the age of 86 and is interred at Arlington National Cemetery. In his honor, a destroyer named USS Maxwell was commissioned in 2002. The Hellcat remained part of naval operations until 1954, when the final F6F models were retired from active squadrons. Some aircraft were repurposed as remotely controlled drones and utilized during the Korean War to strike North Korean targets, while others were sold to various foreign air forces. The French Navy flew Hellcats off the carrier Aramanes until 1961, marking one of the longest operational careers for a World War II fighter. In 1987, the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, restored an F6F Hellcat in the distinctive markings of McCampbell's aircraft, Mincy III, complete with 34 Japanese flags on its fuselage. This meticulously preserved aircraft is now permanently displayed at the museum. Currently, 7 Hellcats remain airworthy and are based in the United States. They frequently participate in air shows and commemorative events. Historical documentation later confirmed the link between O'Hare's visit to Grumman and the development of the Hellcat. In 1991, a naval historian researching World War II carrier operations discovered references to O'Hare's April 1942 meeting within Bureau of Aeronautics files. The historian interviewed Schwendler's assistant, who confirmed that O'Hare's combat insights influenced several key design decisions, such as engine selection and cockpit visibility improvements. The historian estimated that these changes likely saved between 100 and 500 American pilots' lives during the war by enhancing the Hellcat's performance compared to its predecessor, the Wildcat. However, O'Hare never learned of this impact, since he died 18 months before the Hellcat demonstrated its superiority at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Achieving a remarkable kill ratio of 19:1, he never witnessed McCell shoot down 34 Japanese planes. He never saw the Hellcat aircraft dominate the skies over the Pacific, eliminating enemy aviation. Instead, he perished while piloting an aircraft that he had contributed to designing, defending the fleet in the role for which he was trained. This is how innovation truly unfolds during wartime. It doesn't arise from engineering committees or bureaucratic procedures, but rather from combat veterans who survive long enough to convey what's effective. It involves engineers who are willing to listen and act swiftly to implement necessary changes, as well as commanders who have the confidence to approve significant design modifications based on limited data because human lives hang in the balance. If you found this narrative captivating, please give a thumbs up to this video, subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and leave a comment below sharing your location. Thank you for watching and helping preserve these histories.